Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. You are watching W News. Thank you for joining us for our first ever news bulletin, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya English headquarters. We'll be with you at the same time every single day. These are our top stories today. Donald Trump takes a narrow lead over his Democratic rival in the polls as they prepare to go head-to-head tomorrow night. Syria's health ministry says 18 people have been killed and 36 others injured in Israeli airstrikes in the central province of Hama. And Russia says it has captured a settlement in eastern Ukraine, paving the way for their advance on the city of Pokrovsk. Welcome. We begin tonight's programme by turning our attention to the United States, where Donald Trump has taken a narrow lead over his Democratic rival Kamala Harris. Well, as anticipation builds for their first debate face-off, the political landscape is set for a captivating and consequential showdown. Well, for all the latest, we can cross now to Washington and speak to our correspondent there, Nick Harper. Nick, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The polls suggest it's a very tight race, with one Sunday poll suggesting a slight lead for Donald Trump. Just talk us through how the polls have been evolving during the last couple of weeks.
Well, Tom, we've seen a complete shift, really a complete 180 since we've seen the change of candidate for the Democrats. Just a few weeks ago, when it was Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, Donald Trump was leading him by about 5 percentage points or so. That lead has been significantly cut now that we have Kamala Harris representing the Democratic Party. Some polls even suggesting last week that she was ahead of Trump by as much as 5 or 6%. But this poll out over the weekend, the New York Times Siena polls, suggested that if the election were held today, Donald Trump would get 48% of the vote. Kamala Harris would get 47% of the vote. So a very tight neck-and-neck race, according to this survey. And then if you break it down further, looking at the 7 swing states that essentially could decide this election, we see that Kamala Harris is leading in 3 of them: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. That's the famous blue wall that the Democrats know that they need to win if she has a chance of winning the White House. And then they are tied in the 4 other swing states, in Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Arizona. One interesting detail to come out of this poll is that many voters feel that they simply don't know enough about Kamala Harris to make a decision. 28% of registered voters said that they needed to know more about her before they could make a decision on her, whereas Donald Trump, of course, has much more of a record: 4 years in the Oval Office. Only 9% saying that they needed to know more about him. We have seen those polls shift dramatically, and at the moment, 8 weeks out to the election, looking incredibly tight.
Yeah, well, obviously, tomorrow voters will find out more about Kamala Harris, because she's going to go head-to-head with Donald Trump. Will probably be their only face-off on the campaign. Just tell us a little bit about what the 2 candidates are doing today and what we can expect from their debate tomorrow.
Kamala Harris remains at a hotel in Pittsburgh in the state of Pennsylvania. She's been there for about a week, really heavily engaged in that debate preparation. We're told that she's been holding mock debates, 90 minutes without break, where she has set up a stage with studio lighting. She even has someone standing in for Donald Trump so that she can debate with that person in real time. Donald Trump, though, he remains at his property in Florida at Mar-a-Lago. We're told that his debate preparation hasn't been quite as rigorous. We're told he's only held a handful of sessions with advisors, mainly recapping on policy knowledge. But bear in mind that he is in many ways much more of a debate expert than Kamala Harris. This will be his 7th presidential debate. He had 3 against Hillary Clinton back in 2016, 2 against Biden in 2020, and of course another against Biden just a few months before in June this year. During the actual debate itself, we know that the mics will be muted for the other candidate when their rival is speaking. Now that means no interruptions, but it doesn't mean there won't be any distractions. Bear in mind that Donald Trump likes to get under the skin of the other candidate. He likes to switch direction, change subject, essentially talk about what he wants to talk about. And also, there is the possibility of falsehoods. There is a question as to whether Kamala Harris will be able to fact-check him in real time. We're told, though, that from her advisors, she aims to remain cool-headed and act presidential. But she'll also need to lay out more policy details. In many ways, her campaign has been somewhat light on policies so far. She'll need to explain to voters why they need to vote for her. But there is also a worry from the Trump camp that they don't know what type of Trump will appear on the debate stage. Will it be happy Trump, or will it be, in their words, mean bully Trump? Of course, they're hoping that it will be the former, and they're also hoping that their candidate can remain on message and look to the future rather than litigate the past and speak about what went wrong in the 2020 election that, of course, he still feels was stolen from him by Joe Biden.
And just tell us, what's the thinking about what sort of an impact that debate could end up having on voter intentions and ultimately on the opinion polls?
Well, Tom, these presidential debates, they are huge calendar moments in presidential cycles. We've just had the conventions, the 4-day events for both the Republicans first in Milwaukee and then the Democrats in Chicago, where they were able to lay out their platform, of course, introduce and formally nominate their candidate, give plenty of speeches. But it is really the debate where they go toe-to-toe. These two candidates, unscripted, in front of an audience of millions watching, 90 minutes where essentially anything can happen. And therefore, there is a huge potential for it to move the needle when it comes to voters out there. Of course, for Joe Biden, it was essentially campaign ending. He did so badly in June's debate against Donald Trump that he then dropped out just a few weeks later. The thinking is that for Kamala Harris, there is more risk-reward for her. She perhaps needs to do more to win over voters, to tell her what she's all about. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that we've already seen Donald Trump do what he does ahead of debates, and that's blame the host that will be hosting this, the network ABC, saying that they are an unfair network, that they've never been fair to him or his presidential campaign. Really trying to set expectations low, trying to point out that if things go badly wrong for him on the night, it'll be all down to the network rather than his own performance in front of Kamala Harris and those millions of viewers.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed. Our Washington correspondent, Nick Harper, thank you so much for bringing us all the latest there. Let's take a quick look now at some of the other news stories we're following for you now. A manhunt for a suspect in the Interstate 75 shooting stretches into a third day in Kentucky. The Saturday shooting wounded 5 people and struck 12 vehicles. 32-year-old Joseph Couch has been named a suspect after the authorities say they found his SUV and a weapon near the crime scene. At least 45 people have died in landslides and flooding after Typhoon Yagi struck Vietnam during the course of the weekend. A further 22 people remain unaccounted for. Well, the typhoon, which made landfall on Saturday, has been named as Asia's most powerful storm for the year 2024. Well, the capital city of Hanoi is bracing for heavy rain and strong winds, whilst the National Weather Agency has warned of more flooding and landslides during the coming days. Firefighters in the US state of Nevada are continuing to battle massive wildfires that are tearing through a wooded area just south of the city of Reno. Well, high winds are making the task of containing those blazes a massive challenge. Well, as a precaution, parts of Reno have been placed under evacuation orders. And it's a similar story in 2 large swathes of California. Helicopters have been dropping flame retardant on wildfires near Clear Lake City, which lies just to the north of San Francisco. Around 4,000 people have been evacuated there. And separate wildfires in a national forest near Los Angeles are also threatening more than 30,000 homes and businesses. There were loud bangs earlier today in London's Hyde Park, where a military gun salute marked 2 years since King Charles III took the throne. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, was Britain's longest reigning monarch. Well, the King's accession day was actually yesterday, on the 8th of September. But in line with tradition, gun salutes are never held on a Sunday. And in another royal news story, the Princess of Wales, known informally as Kate, announced a short while ago that she has completed her course of chemotherapy. The 42-year-old princess was diagnosed with cancer at the start of the year. Well, Kate says that the last 9 months have been, quote, incredibly tough, and that her focus is now going to be to remain cancer-free. At least 18 people are now known to have been killed in apparent Israeli airstrikes which targeted parts of northwestern Syria on Sunday night. According to the Syrian news agency Sana, some of the missiles fired at the area were intercepted in the skies above Hama province. Well, health officials say that in addition to the 18 people killed, more than 30 people were wounded. These pictures come to us from a hospital in Hama where the injured are being treated. Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Jerusalem by correspondent Noga Tarnopolsky. Thank you so much for joining us, Noga. Just let's start by talking about the latest on that apparent Israeli attack on Syria. Why would Israel want to target that seemingly random area of northwestern Syria?
Well, according to what the Israeli army is allowing us to know, it wasn't random. And what's interesting is that they say it was an Iranian weapon manufacturing plant. That's interesting because it's a real escalation in terms of the Iranian involvement here. We're accustomed to Israel bombing the transfer of Iranian-made weapons through Syria, but this implies that they have set up entire weapons-making plants in Syria, and that's what the Israelis went for.
Yeah, and attacks on what Israel says are Iranian or Iran-backed targets in Syria have actually intensified quite a bit, haven't they, since the 7th of October and also since the start of the war in Gaza, where the death toll is now approaching about 41,000. New evacuation orders have been issued today there in Gaza. And I just wanted to ask you if you could bring us up to speed on the latest regarding the humanitarian situation there in Gaza.
Well, it seems to be a bit of a confusion. We were just informed by UNRWA that more than 400,000 people have very successfully been inoculated against polio. So that seems to have gone very well without any of these kind of catastrophes where a humanitarian or medical area is declared and then gets bombarded anyway. But the Israeli army in Gaza appears to be still present and still active in specific operations. You just mentioned that residents of one neighborhood were told to decamp elsewhere. And on the other hand, the Israeli campaign in Gaza really does not seem to be going anywhere. And the government refuses to define what an end point to this war could be.
Now, Noga, during the course of the weekend, the CIA Director, William Burns, said that a new ceasefire proposal could be put forward during the coming days. He sounded really remarkably optimistic, with words to the effect that there were 90% of the way towards that ceasefire. Do you get the impression that the Israelis and the Palestinians share that kind of optimism?
I don't, and I think as kind of the chief mediating power, it's sort of the Americans' job to put an optimistic face, a face that has at least a horizon for the future, for both Israelis and Palestinians who are really sinking into a kind of despair. And I'm speaking about the people, not the leadership. He also said, William Burns also said that while 90% has been agreed on, the last 10% is the toughest part. And what we're hearing today from Washington is that at no point has Hamas said yes, a flat out yes to any agreement. But we also hear that the United States believes they can exert very serious pressure on Qatar to force Hamas's hand, possibly. Of course, the Israeli government includes ministers who overtly say they're going to try to scuttle the talks. And Netanyahu himself has been very, very ambiguous. So I think what we're seeing are mediating nations who hope to bring a breakthrough, and the two parties, each one for its own reasons, quite reluctant.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Jerusalem correspondent Noga Tarnopolsky, thank you so much for bringing us all the latest. In just a moment, we'll have the very latest on the Russia-Ukraine war. Stay with us for that.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversations.
Let's turn now to the situation in eastern Ukraine, where Russia says that during the course of the last 24 hours, its soldiers have seized control of another settlement in Donetsk. The village of Memrik is about 20 kilometers from the strategic Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, which is a key transport hub for Kyiv's forces. Well, with that in mind, Russia has been intensifying efforts to capture the city and cut off Ukraine's supplies. Well, for more on this, we can cross to Moscow and speak to our correspondent there, Dasha Chernyshova. Thank you so much for joining us, Dasha. What's the latest you're hearing about the situation on the battlefield?
Well, indeed, we have the confirmation from the Russian Ministry of Defense that the settlement of Memrik in the Donetsk People's Republic is now under the control of the Russian military. And this is yet another settlement in this direction that has come over under the Russian control over the past weeks, where the fighting has indeed intensified over the past months. We're also hearing that Russia has been conducting strikes against the military facilities of the Ukrainian military industrial complex elsewhere in the country, including in the Sumy region, where the Russian aviation has been conducting strikes against the concentration of the Ukrainian manpower. We also understand that this is happening against the backdrop of the Ukrainian incursion into Russia's Kursk region, which is still ongoing and which has lasted for more than a month up to this moment. And the Ukrainian side does have the control over the certain territories inside Russia. And we understand that Moscow is saying that even though Ukraine has started this incursion and the plan was to distract Russia and to pull Russian troops from the Donetsk direction and from Donbas in general, Russia has managed to accelerate its advances on the Donetsk direction, instead not taking the troops out from that direction but dealing with the Kursk incursion with other forces. So all in all, Moscow says it is steadily achieving the goals of what it calls its special military operation in Ukraine and continues to destroy the military-industrial complex of Ukraine, as well as the weapons that have been supplied to Kyiv from the Western countries.
Now, Dasha, Ukraine's foreign ministry said today that an Iranian envoy to Kyiv had been summoned. Kyiv obviously expressing concerns about this report that Iran has been supplying Russia with ballistic missiles. That's something Iran denies. I mean, just reading between the lines here, could this mean that Moscow is running low on weaponry?
Well, we have heard the Kremlin commenting on these reports, and the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has suggested that not all reports do correlate with the real situation and with the truth. So he dismissed those reports, saying that Russia is going to build its relations with Iran in a way it sees fit, and saying that those relationship is very important for the Russian side. In the meantime, what we are hearing repeatedly from the officials here in Russia is that Moscow has managed to accelerate its military-industrial complex, the output of the weapons, of ammunition, and says that it is at the moment supplying all the needs of its operation on its own. And indeed, we are hearing that the military-industrial complex has gained the huge momentum, employing a large number of people and producing the largest amount of weapons in decades. So certainly in Russia, there is a very clear understanding that Russia is going to achieve its goals in Ukraine by the military means. And for that, we understand that the increase in the budget has has been allocated. So the rhetoric we are getting from the Russian officials here is that Moscow is not going to talk about the supplies of weapons from other countries, while insists that it is producing everything on its own.
And just lastly, Dasha, I mean, do you get the impression that Moscow still sees the prospect of finding some sort of a negotiated solution to the situation there?
Well, indeed, since the start of the Ukrainian incursion into Russia's Kursk region, the rhetoric in Moscow has been quite straightforward, with the officials saying that no chance of talking about peace prospects as long as the Ukrainian troops are on the Russian soil, taking the control over the Russian settlements, and calling that a provocation. Now we are hearing from the Russian officials that indeed there could be the negotiated settlement for the conflict in Ukraine. But for that, Moscow says that the Western countries have to be ready. They have to be willing, and they have to allow Kyiv to actually engage into those negotiations, because it has always been in the Russian position that Ukraine wanted to strike the arrangement with Russia back in 2022, when the sides and delegations have met in Istanbul, and Moscow insisted it was because of the Western influence, and particularly those of the British establishment and the American establishment, that arrangement was never signed. So now we are hearing from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying that at the moment there is not a single peace initiative that has been proposed by the international mediators that does relate to the rights of the Russian-speaking population. He insisted that it is the territories, the exchange of territories, that the Ukrainian side is insisting on, and this is the wrong approach, according to Moscow. So there is a sense that there could be a negotiated settlement, but for that, Moscow says there has to be the desire and the will on both sides. However, Moscow also notes that the Western countries at this moment are not interested in what they want to do is to defeat Russia on the battlefield, to inflict the so-called strategic defeat against Moscow.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for bringing us all the latest there. Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Thank you. Let's get a check now of some of the business news stories we're keeping an eye on. Lebanon's former central bank chief Riyad Salameh will remain in custody following on from a day of questioning. That's amidst an investigation into a series of financial crimes. Salameh, who is widely blamed for the collapse of Lebanon's financial system, denies the charges. Elon Musk is the richest person in the world, estimated to be worth around $250 billion US. But now the 53-year-old Tesla owner is set to become the world's first ever trillionaire. According to a new report from the Informa Connect Academy, which tracks wealth, Musk could reach trillionaire status by the year 2027. And as a result of the ongoing war in Gaza, Israel's finance ministry has cut the country's growth forecast. Israeli GDP is now expected to rise 1.1%. That's down sharply from the earlier forecast of 1.9%. Well, last month, Israel's debt rating was downgraded from A+ to A by the rating agency Fitch. Let's give you a quick reminder now of the top stories we're following for you. Donald Trump has a narrow lead over his Democratic rival in the polls as the pair prepare to go head-to-head tomorrow night in a debate. Syria's health ministry says that 18 people have been killed and 36 others injured in Israeli airstrikes in central Hama province. And Russia says it has captured a settlement in eastern Ukraine, paving the way for their advance on the city of Pokrovsk. Well, that is all we have time for. I'll be back at the same time tomorrow with all the day's headlines. Coming up next is Hadley Gamble's special interview with the US Special Envoy to Yemen. And we'll also be hearing from Rosanna Lockwood, who'll be presenting Global News Today. That's a roundup of top international news with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers. In the hot seat today, the British broadcaster Piers Morgan and the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. That is in just under an hour from now at 2:30 p.m.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversations.
Tim Lenderking, it's great to have you joining us. Walk me through the situation that's currently taking place. How close are we to an ecological disaster?
Thanks so much, Hadley. I think you're referring to the fires that are burning on board a tanker that has 1 million barrels of oil on it. We've been through this before last year with a Safar tanker. It was a successful international operation to avert a major oil spill. We're talking about a spill that's 4 times the Exxon Valdez in Alaska, several decades ago. This would decimate Yemen's fishing industry, interfere further with freedom of navigation, sensitive coastal ecosystems destroyed. It's a disaster, and it's easily preventable. It should never have happened in the first place. Obviously, it comes in the context of the Houthis attacking ships in the Red Sea to make a statement about Gaza. For most of us, that statement falls totally flat. They're not doing anything to help Gaza or Palestinians by attacking random ships in such a reckless and indiscriminate manner. They've sunk a ship, they've killed crew, they've set this ship on fire, and they've obstructed, despite public pronouncements, they've obstructed the effort to salvage and tow the ship and put the fires out. So it's a very, very delicate moment.
So this specifically, give me a time frame. How close are we to this disaster taking place? Days away?
The experts are saying that 10 days from now, you could start seeing damage to the hulls. There are multiple fires burning on board the ship. There's no oil spill yet that we've been able to see, and lots of people are monitoring the ship for that very reason. But it's a race against time. These fires are burning on board a ticking time bomb, and it must be dealt with. And that means parties from this Yemen conflict and parties that are in conflict with each other need to work together and coordinate and make this happen.
Let's take a step back. How did we get here? Because this was a conflict that members of the current administration said many, many times was a direct result of Saudi intervention in Yemen. You've been in that region for a very long time. Walk me through this.
So when I was appointed the envoy for Yemen by the Biden administration very early in the tenure of the administration, it was the first time that the U.S. had appointed an envoy for Yemen. And what we did was partner very closely with Saudi Arabia, the Omanis, others in the neighborhood, and in fact, the Yemeni parties themselves, who have a key voice, obviously, in what happens to their country, and with the UN envoy. And with these combined efforts, we're able to establish a truce in what had been an 8-year civil war with 400 projectiles coming across the border from Yemen into Saudi Arabia every year. And
I remember seeing them in the street in Riyadh.
You remember, right? And you could hear and feel debris coming down. And there were Saudi airstrikes into Yemen, also destructive. And this situation has stopped. And I think it's a major accomplishment and shouldn't be lost in the current context. There is a truce in Yemen. It has held since April 2022. And there was a very strong effort to create a roadmap for a peace process. And that was achieved through a lot of work between the Saudis and the Houthis and the Yemen government, working together essentially to reach agreement on a roadmap. That roadmap is there. It's out there. But it's on pause because Gaza happened on October 7th. Very shortly thereafter, you have the Houthis and other groups tied to Iran trying to assert themselves. And the Houthis in particular, I think, violating international norms by attacking commercial ships, civilian ships, at first saying that they were attacking ships that were going in and out of Israel. Not the case. These are indiscriminate, random, reckless attacks on any ship that is moving in the Red Sea in their own bid to establish their supremacy as rulers of the Red Sea. It's not going to happen. The international community is not going to support that. It's not going to allow that. So that's unfortunately the context that sets us to your first question about the tanker, why it's on fire. It's something, as I said, that is so preventable and should be dealt with very quickly and urgently. The means are there, the resources are there. Let's get them out, put those fires out, tow the ship.
And you're using independent contractors in order to put this fire out, correct?
That's right. We're in touch with them, but this is
that's because it's too dangerous for U.S. ships to be in that.
Well, I think the way that this is evolving is that you have a very close relationship on the seas with European and EU-led, European Union-led maritime mission, Auspides, and they're partnering very closely, doing a great job, I think, of providing security escorts for the salvage team that would go out there. It's a shame that security escorts are needed. Think of all the resources, and that's because there's a Houthi threat. The Houthis could attack the salvage crew. They've said they won't. They've said publicly that they won't interfere. They must adhere to what they themselves have promised for this to be successful.
What is the plan to stop these attacks?
Well, more broadly, I think what the Houthis have said is that there must be a ceasefire in Gaza. We all want a ceasefire in Gaza. Nothing really on the world stage right now, certainly in the Middle East, is more important than a ceasefire in Gaza, an end to the killing, and a hostage release. And that's something that the United States is working very closely, as you know, with key allies to do that. The Houthis aren't doing anything to contribute to an end to the Gaza conflict.
It's just an excuse.
They are, pushing their own agenda. It's become political theater, essentially, but with very grave consequences. Lives are being lost on the Red Sea. As I said, this catastrophe would be hugely damaging to what is a pristine waterway and a vital international waterway.
But how long, in your mind, is this going to take to put an end to these attacks? Because it requires military intervention, and the United States, as usual, is paying the bulk of this.
Well, I think everybody's paying the bulk of it. If you look at the impact on Chinese shipping and the Chinese economy, it's greater than it is on the U.S. economy because so many ships are having to divert and avoid the area.
Right, but it's our weapons, right, that are being used to take these guys out.
Well, we're essentially not taking anybody out. What we've done is focus very specifically on Houthi military capability, right? What capabilities are they using, drones and missiles, to attack Red Sea ships? We're hitting those.
Yeah.
We're hitting those, but, it hasn't stopped the Houthis. They're resupplying, they're circumventing UN Security Council resolutions, they're getting support from Iran. Iran's playing a key role, I think, to fan the flames, and we need the Iranians literally to not do that.
Yeah.
And to support the salvage effort on this particular ship, but also encourage the Houthis to dial it back. There's no need for a big military theater in the Red Sea at this particular point. Let's devote the resources to ending the Gaza conflict. And I'm sure that when that happens, it will give an opportunity for other crises in the Middle East to de-escalate. And we're going to have to seize that moment.
Oh, you're a diplomat. What is our leverage right now with Iran to convince them not to support the Houthis in these attacks?
I know that the Iranians have said that they're not supportive of they don't want another front breaking out in the Red Sea.
They've got enough fronts as it is.
Lebanon border is hot. Gaza's obviously hot. There have been some attacks elsewhere in the region. So it's a very inflammatory situation right now. And the Iranians can help by encouraging the Houthis to dial it back. And we as the United States have used every opportunity in the past few months to explore every avenue for de-escalation. We've put proposals on the table. We've communicated with the various Yemeni parties. The Houthis are holding hostage a crew from a ship that they hijacked in November, a 25-member crew from 5 countries that have nothing to do with the Gaza conflict, nothing to do with Israel.
But are we surprised? I mean, it's the Houthis.
I have to say that the Houthis, for anybody who needed them, are showing their true colors, right? They've taken advantage, as we were saying, of a Gaza conflict to push their own agenda, to amplify their own, to project their own power on the Red Sea. We don't think that that is good for Yemen's peace process. It has stalled the peace process. It's put that roadmap that the Houthis themselves worked toward. It's put that on the shelf. There's no way that the international community wants to see a warring party like the Houthis.
But they're supplied by Iran, right?
They are supplied by
Iran.
That's correct.
And we don't have any leverage to convince the Iranians to stop doing that at this point.
Well, I'm not sure. I think, there are ways of getting messages to the Iranians, and we do that on a number of different crises that are happening. So there's a moment, I think, where Iran, which welcomed the truce in Yemen in April 2022, and which has conveyed some concern about an ecological disaster in the Red Sea, capitalizing on those, it would be great for the Iranians to support de-escalation in the Red Sea, irrespective of what's going on in Gaza, because we don't know exactly when there's going to be a Gaza ceasefire. Why should Yemen's crisis, which needs international attention, there's a very serious humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and the Houthi behavior is essentially exacerbating that humanitarian crisis. They're also making it more difficult for humanitarian actors in Yemen to do their job. They've rounded up more than 100 staff, Yemenis from UN and international organizations. These are humanitarian workers in Yemen working to help Yemen.
Yeah.
They're not spies. They're not international traitors or whatever. They're just Yemenis working for the benefit of their own country. Let those people go. Let them do their jobs.
What about Russia? Because there are reports that the Russians are supporting the Houthis as well. What evidence do we have that that is happening?
Well, we've been very concerned about those reports, and we've dug into that, and that would be very unfortunate and very inflammatory for the Yemen conflict and for the region if Russia were to abandon what has been a principle which we share. There's no military solution to the conflict in Yemen. That's been a core principle for the Russians, the Chinese, and the United States over these past couple of years, and it's been very helpful to work with that common ground. But the Russians, if they're going to start arming the Houthis, that's a game changer. That's very serious. Saudi Arabia is not going to like that. I don't think the Omanis would like that. I don't think anybody wants to see that. That's going to inflame the conflict. What we're really focusing right now on is de-escalation, literally putting the fires out, as we're trying to do with this tanker.
Just a few days ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin was on stage and thanking Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, for his work in the hostage negotiations between the United States and Russia. You spent a lot of time in Riyadh prior to this role. Is it a surprise to you that Saudi Arabia has become such an important conduit in those conversations?
It's not. I think Saudi Arabia is, just plays a key role in the Middle East region, and it's reforming its own approach to development, diversifying, pushing, developing other industries, its own infrastructure, propelling women into the forefront of diplomacy and Saudi society in a way that, when I was there some years ago, was not happening, or happening very slowly. And I think, important actors, including the great powers, also recognize the important role that Saudi Arabia plays, and they're integral to ending the Yemen crisis.
In your mind, is this a very different role that Saudi is now taking on? Because obviously, as you say, in the past, they haven't been at the forefront necessarily of great power negotiations, but they're there now.
I do think it's a recognition of the important role they play as a member of the Islamic community with the holy sites in Saudi Arabia, and I think their economic power and their political weight. We talk to the Saudis about so many different issues, everything from investment and trade to, bringing the conflict in Sudan to an end, working on relations with other Middle Eastern countries. So they're playing a very vital role right now. And I think, again, as the U.S. envoy for Yemen, they're key, absolutely key to ending the conflict once and for all, for moving in Yemen, moving beyond the truce that I mentioned, de-escalating the Red Sea attacks, and then trying to bring Yemeni parties together to the table in a political resolution of the Yemen conflict, which is ultimately our goal, and we remain fully committed to that.
We see the Secretary of State making multiple trips, obviously, to the region in the last few months, and essentially trying to give us a preview, if you will, of a U.S.-Saudi strategic agreement, whether it be on security or on perhaps Israeli-Saudi relations. In your mind, how big a part of these future agreements will Yemen be?
I think Yemen has been a big factor in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, but also as a regional crisis. And I think the fact that the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and other countries, Oman, the UAE, are working very closely to try and end the Yemen conflict, there's a recognition that this is possible. And the fact that there is a truce, I think, was a great achievement, but it's not enough. It is not bringing the kind of stability and opportunity for the Yemeni people yet until there's more stability and ability to develop their economy. This is something that the United States is all in on. That's what we want to see happen. We've got to get through this extremely difficult period, these attacks on the Red Sea, the Gaza crisis inflaming the entire region and creating tensions in all directions. We've got to get through this and get back to de-escalation. I believe it's possible on the Yemen side.
Do you believe that this is going to happen before the U.S. election?
I think that's difficult to predict, but I know that the administration is determined on the Yemen file to make progress, right? Just keep pushing at the things that have been successful so far and keep working with partners to de-escalate. That's really the major thrust of the administration.
We are losing freedom of navigation. In your mind, how important is it these next few days in terms of getting this one ship's fire under control to signal that the Americans have a handle on this situation? Because right now it seems as if the United States, the most important and the most impressive and most powerful Navy in the world, has totally lost control.
You need to protect freedom of navigation with partners, and obviously the countries that border these maritime spaces need to work with us. Many of them do. But there's a non-state actor, the Houthis, that are dabbling in the middle of all this, again, trying to assert their power, their political authority, using Gaza as an excuse. And it's very damaging for the region's economy. We talk about, the Suez Canal incomes that the Egyptians rely on. Those have declined by 50%. The Houthi attacks are hurting humanitarian aid into Sudan. They're hurting Ethiopia, Djibouti. We talk to all of these countries. They may not say something publicly, but they're all privately acknowledging to us that they are against these Houthi attacks. They do not support them. They do not think that Gaza provides an excuse to do this. So we've got to bring those conversations, I think, more into the open, put more pressure on the Houthis. This is not the way for the Houthis to gain international legitimacy. This is not going to build support for them as a credible actor in Yemen. It does the opposite.
Yeah. But in terms of forcing that agenda, how do you do that at this point, other than by means military?
I think you have to look at the different ways that we can put pressure on the Houthis and try and achieve results. Again, Gaza seems to be very important to all this, but again, I think we have to look at ways that we can compartmentalize, if you will, Yemen and see what we can do in the Yemen context. And there it's working very closely with our partners, with regional allies. And indeed, we have, pretty vigorous conversations with the Chinese about ways that we can cooperate to work together to de-escalate the situation in Yemen. Yemen's economy needs a lot of attention. Regional voices, I think, could do a lot more to speak up because they're being negatively affected by this.
For example?
I think you can pick any country. You can pick any country in the region.
We're talking about Jordan, Egypt?
Any. Yeah, all of them. They're all negatively affected by this. And they also want de-escalation across the board, right? No one wants
What's holding them
Hezbollah
back in your mind? Is it because of the connection with Gaza, or?
I think so. I think Gaza is weighing very heavily on all of our minds, but it also makes it more difficult, I think, for regional countries and allies to speak out as they need to do.
Would it be fair to say that until there's a resolution on Gaza, there won't be a resolution in the Red Sea?
I'm not going to say that because I believe, and I think it's the job that was entrusted to my team and me is that we have to keep working looking at every opportunity to find ways out of this, to defuse. And there are very specific things that the Houthis could do. I mentioned the hijacking of the ship, release the crew. There's no reason that those 25 crewmen can barely have a phone call with their own families. Why are they still being held in Yemen? Let them go. Let the local staff that they've detained inside Yemen show that they are, willing to adhere to some principles other than their own sort of personal gain. I think we're looking for those indications from the Houthis, and their backers could push them in that direction as well.
So, to the idea that we have lost the battle of the Red Sea, how do you respond to that? Because it seems as if we're just in a stasis.
I don't think we've lost the battle for the Red Sea. I think there are opportunities. We're looking at various options to reinstate freedom of navigation. We view this as a temporary situation. Again, as I say, there's no way that the international community is going to allow any non-state actor to continue to attack ships from any part of the Red Sea.
Yeah. But they have been for months. So that's
true.
Where we are.
Their capability to do so has been degraded, but their determination, because as I say, as some of their arsenal is destroyed, they're able to resupply. So we need support to cut off the resupply. Yeah. That's a big part of it, and that's coming essentially from Iran. So that's an area where we're really calling on the Iranians, stop resupplying, stop the smuggling in contravention of UN Security Council resolutions, help us work to de-escalate. It's good for the region.
Yeah. When you take a step back and look at the situation more broadly, China, obviously there are conversations around Taiwan, around freedom of navigation, what any conflict in the South China Sea might look like. They're seeing the Houthis get away with this, at least for now, at a relatively low cost to them and a big cost to us. How worrying is that to you?
Yeah, I think that that conversation that we're having with the Chinese is very important. We will continue to do so.
But they're watching us, and they're seeing us fail.
Well, I don't think we're not where we want to be. That's that's clear. But the Chinese economy is being hurt by this situation. They will acknowledge that to us. The Russian economy, et cetera. So it's a non-tenable situation, and there are multiple ways to dial up the pressure. The question is, who's going to do that, or who's going to do that with us or on their own? We need to look at ways, and you can't.
And will we do that before a U.S. election?
You can't divorce this from a regional context, which is very, very hot and very provocative.
Yeah.
So while I say we're making every effort to compartmentalize and focus on Yemen, I do acknowledge that the Gaza situation is creating problems, more problems for everybody in the region. That needs to be settled.
In your mind, is this something perhaps not done by the U.S. election, but perhaps done by the end of the year? And I ask timelines simply because we keep being told by the Secretary of State that a big agreement is coming with Saudi Arabia. And I'm just putting two and two together.
Everybody's working on that agreement, and everybody's working on the Red Sea as well. I'm hopeful that we'll see good progress in the coming months.
Tim, walk me through how receptive the Yemeni government has been to this work, because essentially you're dealing with, for what is for them a terrorist group.
That's right. They do regard the Houthis as a terrorist group. And in fact, we have placed the Houthis this year on one of the terrorist lists that we have at our disposal.
About time.
Some say long overdue. But the Yemen government is the legitimate government that's recognized by the international community, by the United Nations. And there is an 8-person presidential leadership council that leads that government. They need support. They need international support. The Houthis have essentially strangled the Yemen economy. So it's almost impossible for Yemen to produce oil, which it has, produce natural gas, which it has at this particular time. So they're very dependent on outside support at this moment. That's not because they don't have resources. It's because the Houthis have strangled the economy, and that's unfortunate. So we meet with the Yemen government leadership. We, the Europeans, the international community, they will be at the UN General Assembly. We'll have meetings with them there. We'll be talking about what we can do as an international community to strengthen them. For that day, we all want to see when there is a political dialogue, Yemenis talking together about the future of their country.
How important in your mind is it that these conversations are wrapped up in a positive way by January? Because there could be a new administration, and they may not necessarily take the same line.
Yeah, I'm pushing certainly as hard as I can from our side, and I have the backing of the administration.
I mean, is that something you use as leverage in these conversations?
The region, moves at its own rhythm, right? So we can't entirely control that. But I would really like to see not only this tanker, of course, dealt with as quickly as possible, like next week, but then move from there into greater de-escalation in the Red Sea and building up the Yemeni party so that they can actually start a political negotiation on the future of the country.
Tim, it's great to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Hadley.